When describing their kids, some parents might say, he has a strong desire for accuracy. She's a perfectionist. They are highly attuned to the environment and have very intense emotions. Or she has a strong sense of fairness and justice. And parents may wonder, is my child autistic? Others may say, is my child gifted? And that child might be both. Today on the podcast, we're talking about giftedness and autism. You do not want to miss this episode. My guest today is Dr. Megan Helmen. She's a pediatric neuropsychologist who has been providing evaluations for over 12 years and has worked in the autism community for over 20 years. Early on, she heard disheartening stories from parents about how they received their child's autism diagnosis. And she set out to be the person who could provide the services in a more supportive and educational manner. Dr. Helmen believes in balancing clinical expertise and research-based interventions with connection and a sense of humor. Her clinical process is neurodiversity affirming and continually evolving, and Dr. Helmen is here with us today.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hello, Dr. Helmen. Welcome to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning.
Hello. Thanks so much for having me.
I really appreciate you being here, and I am so eager to jump into this conversation with you. And one of the things I said when I reached out to you is that I attended your presentation to the American Academy of Pediatric Neuropsychologists and felt that the information that you shared, that you presented, was so relevant and important, not only for psychologists and neuropsychologists who largely attended the talk, but also for parents, for educators, and allied professionals as well. So I really appreciate you coming and having this discussion with me.
Well, thank you. I appreciate any opportunity to talk more on that subject. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. And, a few weeks ago, I interviewed a neurodivergent psychologist, and the episode was Why Did I Get Missed? Which kind of fits with what you talked about during your presentation. We discussed individuals, primarily women, who aren't diagnosed with ADHD or autism until adulthood. And when I was sitting in your presentation, I was wondering, and I'd love to pose this question to you, do you think the overlap between giftedness, which we're talking about today, and autism, which we're also talking about today, explains some of the delays in understanding some neurodivergent individuals?
I do think so. Oftentimes there's a misunderstanding that if a child is gifted, they can't also have a disability like autism, or a child's autism, the way it presents itself in the world, will cause others to overlook their giftedness. And when children have the cognitive capacity to kind of engage in observation and pattern recognition and mimicry, and they use some of these compensating abilities to hide or kind of mask some of their autistic traits. And so people will say, oh, but they're able to do A, B, C, and D, and so they can't be autistic. And what they're missing is what's happening behind the scenes, which is a lot of effortful, laborious, kind of calculating, observing, and working really hard to be able to present that way. And then that eventually leads to a lot of burnout or withdrawal and other kinds of difficulties. So yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that really struck me. And I think parents and even educators who have, students in their classrooms, teens at home, might struggle to understand, some of the differences that they're seeing in their children and their students compared to others. And, giftedness and and autism, which we're going to talk about, you talk about some of the overlap. And maybe we can start by just talking about what is giftedness for listeners who might have heard this term, who may even have kids who've been identified with gifted, but don't really know what it means. How about we start by, what is giftedness exactly?
Sure. And there's not a lot of agreement on a solid definition. The National Association for Gifted Children, their definition talks about exceptional skills and abilities that warrant specialized education. Not special education, but specialized in terms of a different format, a different pace, a different style of learning. You can think of it more objectively in terms of how does a student perform on a certain, standardized cognitive measure. And so researchers will use a cutoff of, the top 10% or top 5%, top 2%. For me, I think it's, important to think about those objective data, but also to think about the qualitative aspects of giftedness, which is truly a different way of being in the world. It is a form of neurodivergence. So it's thinking with more depth and complexity. There's often more intensity of experience in emotions, sensory sensitivity, and, just a lot of attention to detail. They tend to struggle more with things like perfectionism and emotional overwhelm. And so there are some people who will say, well, if this is a gift, where do I return it? Because it can come with its own set of challenges, right? Being kind of an outlier always comes with some challenges as well. But that's maybe the best, most concise way I could describe it.
And I love that you mentioned that it is a form of neurodivergence, but it's not a diagnosis, even though there are challenges, like you're saying, associated with being gifted.
Right. And in my talk, what I like to do when I'm talking about giftedness is show the diagnostic criteria for intellectual disability, because we can appreciate that kids who are an outlier on one end of the statistical kind of bell curve, we understand that they need their learning set up in a different way and that they need a certain set of supports. But if you kind of flip that on its head and change out some of the IQ scores and the wording in that diagnosis, it also describes giftedness. So someone who's this far from the average, who has exceptionalities in these ways. And so, a lot of times we're not really appreciating kind of the divergent experience of gifted kids and adults. And it's been fun to find my way into this corner of psychology, because there are people out there doing really amazing work highlighting those specific challenges and the needs of those people.
Right. And it is so clear when you talk about some of the difficulties that kind of come alongside these tremendous gifts and talents, that there is a need. You talk about modifying their educational experience to really help them learn and reach that full potential.
Absolutely. And it's so important because the standard, I like to explain to parents that an education system is set up as systems are intended to serve as many people as well as possible. And when you have a difference like autism or giftedness or both of those things, you tend to not fall into that group of what works well for most people. And so it takes some tweaking and some adjusting, and sometimes it takes throwing out the whole system and doing something else altogether. So.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people are feeling that does need to be done. There needs to be, and there has been a big shift in how we perceive autism, how we perceive learning disabilities and learning differences. I mean, I was trained on the medical model where everything was pathologized. And now we really have moved to a more neurodiversity affirming approach, which I think is the right direction.
I agree. And I think the simplest way to understand that, for me, I spend a lot of time thinking about how can we expect someone to feel and do better when we start with, here's what's wrong with you. And that's the medical model. That's an important approach when you have a tumor or a disease or something that really needs to be fixed and cured. But in developmental disabilities, it's, the approach should be, this is part of understanding who you are. where do we go from here? How do we work with this? How do we support you? And for gifted autistic individuals, there's not much understanding around who they are and what they need and what works best for them. And fortunately, there's been kind of a slew of new research in the last few years interviewing gifted and autistic adults, autistic college students, and asking them what worked well for you. What do you wish others had done? What do you wish you had known sooner? And so we're finding out that really the importance of leaning into strengths, offering flexibility for those students, they're fostering their interests, connecting them to community and helping them understand more about themselves is really what works best. And that lines up with the neurodiversity affirming model.
Absolutely. And I think we're learning, as you were saying, that understanding the lived experience is such an important part of incorporating that aspect into our understanding of a lot of these neurodivergent presentations, because, that hasn't been the approach with research historically.
Right. And I do like to mention that I am not autistic because there is an understandable sentiment in the autistic community about nothing about us without us. I do relate to the twice exceptional experience. I have areas within my profile that are, at the 99th percentile. And then I have some pretty significant challenges around executive functioning. And so I, like many twice exceptional people, find that certain easy things are hard and hard things are easy. But I have done a lot of consulting with and connecting with autistic professionals on my writing and what I include in my presentations. And so, it's really trying to tap into that lived experience, like you said, and include those voices and perspectives.
Right. When you're talking about giftedness, you mentioned some characteristics. You talked about, obviously, there are extraordinary talents, but there are also these intense emotions. There are, there's perfectionism, there's passion about specific interests. And it gets tricky because those are a lot of the traits that we see in autistic individuals. I'd love for you to kind of talk to our listeners about, now that you've kind of described giftedness, how would you define autism? And given this overlap,
I think it's helpful to understand that the autistic mind tends to do best when there is a structure, a plan, a routine, an algorithm. And that is because the autistic brain is not as well organized in terms of the pathways and kind of ability to process a lot of information. So what happens is their brain is actually processing a lot more information because it's not able to tune out what's irrelevant and tune into what is relevant. And so there's a lot more information passing through and in a less organized way. So therefore, it's very helpful for an autistic mind to have things that are predictable, planned, routine, familiar. And if you think about social settings, social interactions, they're a million shades of gray. They change moment to moment. There's never really a clear script to follow. And same with emotions, that you can't see them, you can't hold them. They're unpredictable. They come in infinite forms. And so the autistic mind has a lot more difficulty processing social, emotional, and some sensory information. And so the diagnostic criteria are really built around that concept. So I like to explain to parents, there's kind of a social piece to the diagnosis and there's a behavioral piece. So the social piece is really struggling with taking others' perspectives, kind of having the social intuition to kind of engage in a back and forth interaction. Their communication tends to look different. They might not use or pick up on nonverbal cues in the same way as others do. And that can make it hard to create and maintain friendships and relationships in a way that looks neurotypical. And then the behavioral side of the criteria have to do with that, like kind of need for routine, repetitive behaviors, differences in sensory processing and intense interests, and that those things being present are at a level where it's causing some interference in day-to-day life or causing a lot of distress.
And a lot of that distress is related to something you said earlier about the way, our systems, our society is set up, right? It's set up for neurotypical individuals, and it doesn't support individuals who think, learn, experience the world in different ways.
Right. And so your question about the overlap, the gifted kids that I am seeing in my clinic are often there for an evaluation to determine, is this giftedness, is this autism, is it both? So I am seeing a certain section of the gifted population that may not, obviously if you met one gifted person, you met one gifted person, just like with autism, right? So I want to acknowledge that I'm seeing kids who already have a lot of overlap, but the perfectionism is a big one. Having a lot of emotional intensity, having a strong focus on issues around justice and fairness, the rule followers of the world who are also making sure everyone else is following the rules. A lot of big, passionate interests in both gifted kids and autistic kids. So there is a lot of overlap. And what I think is helpful to understand is that in autism, the need for routine, the need for those repetitive actions or stimming, what we call stimming, the need for sensory supports is significant. Whereas in a gifted individual who has some similar traits, there may be a preference or a tendency towards perfectionism, a preference for order, a preference for lower sensory input. But with an autistic individual, it is a need, just like if you thought about somebody with a physical disability, they really may need an elevator or a ramp versus, as someone who's like, well, that would be better for me, but I can manage either way. And so recognizing that autism is a disability and that these aren't like, well, I'd really rather you be quieter, but I can handle it if it's loud. Like, that's going to overwhelm, a certain individual with autism, whereas someone else with some sensory sensitivities can still manage.
Right. And I think that distinction between a preference and a need is so important when individuals are trying to figure it out. And obviously, bringing young people to someone like you or a professional who can help them tease it apart, because, it really takes a skill. You can't make this distinction or make a determination of autism or giftedness with TikTok videos, which people have tried to do.
Yeah, it's so complicated, and it's made more complicated by the fact that in my graduate training, I think in most clinical psychology programs, which are casting a wide net across an already very broad field, we don't get any particular training on giftedness and minimal, if any, on autism. And so the autism has been an interest of mine for over 20 years. And I kind of found my way into the giftedness part because I noticed I related to a lot of the bright kids I saw, and then really enjoyed that process of teasing out kind of what you said, that those overlapping traits and trying to better understand these kids so they can be better supported. But finding that kids with both autism and giftedness are just often overlooked and misunderstood. And, you really have to seek out training and education in those areas. And then get a lot of experience. So it's just hard to find people who can take that on. And of course, a TikTok video most certainly cannot. But I can appreciate too that it's helpful to see people who seem to understand you, right? And so these kids are finding people on TikTok who they can relate to, and there's positives in that too. It's an interesting time we're living in. I'll say it's really happening in real time, this shift around kind of self-identification and
yes.
What does that mean? And to whom is that valid, and how do you use that to your advantage? Or I don't know.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to watch it unfold.
It is. And, it really speaks to the idea that people are looking for answers. And one of the things that you mentioned in your presentation that really stood out for me was that identification can save a life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I would love for you to talk more about that, because again, when you talk about autism, there is this social vulnerability that puts individuals at risk, and there are mental health challenges associated with not understanding why you're struggling. And you can see that in giftedness as well.
Yeah, and that kind of ties in your earlier question about neurodiversity and neurodiversity affirming practices, because I think it's a misconception that being neurodiversity affirming doesn't mean it's just rainbows and butterflies and rah-rah, and this is wonderful. Like, it's a disability because the autistic individual in the neurotypical world faces a lot of extreme challenges and can find it very hard to find others to connect with and who understand them. And that's a human need. And without that human connection and feeling understood and feeling valued, there is such high risk for depression and anxiety. And then you think about, going out into the social world and getting kind of burned over and over again. I liken it to if you walked into a kitchen when the power is out, or the lights are off, but you will go in and you get burned. You're like, oh gosh, I got to be more careful the next time. But you wander in the kitchen again, you get burned again, and you can't figure out like why you're getting burned or where. You just stop going in, right? Like, it's not a perfect analogy, but I think that's a lot kind of the experience of autistic people, is they kind of stop wanting to try because it's painful. People's reactions to them are painful. And then you have just the fact that life isn't predictable and routine and structured all the time. And so, yeah, they're enduring a lot more and with minimal understanding from others. And so, of course, that can cause mental health symptoms like depression. And also, we know that the higher the IQ in an autistic individual actually presents more susceptibility to suicidal thoughts. And, what autistic adults are telling us through newer research studies is that self-understanding, connection to others who understand them and their community are really important in supporting positive mental health.
Right. And I think that speaks to another reason for getting a proper diagnosis, for getting identified, making sure that this is autism, or this is giftedness, or this is both, or it's neither. Because, in both autism and giftedness, you have individuals whose brains are developing differently than peers. And as a result, it impacts their ability to navigate in a world that is not designed and set up for them, as we've been saying. And some of those barriers are social barriers, which, contribute to some of the mental health challenges you talked about.
Right. I think a big piece of supporting them is adjusting our own expectations. It's not a fair expectation that their social world will look how we expect it to look, and that's okay. So their social needs may be different. They may need a different balance of downtime to social time, and that's okay. What we want is for anyone to be able to have social connection when they want it or when they need it. And that may take some extra support to help them find their people. It doesn't require a lot of what we used to do. The way I was trained, even just 15, 20 years ago was, well, let's drill them on how to act in a neurotypical social setting and get them to act in that way because that's the expectation. And then they will somehow magically begin to take that on as their own way of being in the world and socialize in a way that's more comfortable for everybody else. And that's, of course, not how it was described, but that's kind of my tongue-in-cheek way of looking back on it, which is, that doesn't make any sense. You're asking them to be somebody else. And I think it's okay and important to teach social skills that maintain safety and allow others to have, to feel safe around the autistic person, like make sure they respect physical boundaries, teach them skills that will help them to do the things they want to do that are meaningful to them. But there's no use really, and perhaps even harm in drilling them to, and I say drilling because that's truly the way, it in a lot of forms of ABA, it's a lot of sitting and drilling those skills. And that's just not a good way to spend time. Much better to support them in who they are and find their people who socialize in the same way as they do.
Yes. And that really speaks to the idea that with identification comes, again, this understanding, right? You're providing an understanding for them, for their loved ones, to understand the challenges that they faced. Also recognizing autistic gifts or the gifts of a gifted and talented person. And at the same time, like you're saying, provide support and address issues that lead to significant struggles in their daily lives. It's not about changing the essence of a person, and it shouldn't be.
Right, because that in itself is potentially harmful. And our first duty as psychologists is to do no harm. And that really came to a head for me in recognizing that there is harm in seeing and approaching it from a perspective of this is something wrong with you that we need to fix. And what it should be is, here's what we're learning, and having more knowledge supports better understanding, and better understanding leads to the right supports and more compassion. Because gifted autistic children are so often misunderstood, it's very hard for parents to set expectations appropriately when they have a child who's talking to them like they're a wise college student, and yet they can't get dressed in the morning, or they can hardly make it through a meal without a meltdown. And so parents are going, well, you must be doing this to upset me, or it feels that way, because how can this be that I have a child who's so capable in one area and struggling so significantly in another? And when I say this to parents, that it's really like parenting multiple children in one, I get a lot of big head nods, and kind of having it described that way for the first time is very validating, because, twice exceptional kids, their profiles are very, lots of peaks and valleys. It's not kind of even development across the board.
Yes. And when we talk about struggles, they are even harder to see in individuals who are autistic and also gifted, because, they may be suppressing traits or masking.
Right. And I had a middle school age girl once tell me she was exceptionally bright, 99.9th percentile. And she explained to me how she can talk to up to 3 or 4 people at a time if she knows them and what they think is funny, because it's like she was essentially explaining to me that she had created this algorithm she could follow in a conversation, and she could do it for up to 3 to 4 people at a time, which is a reflection of her cognitive capacity. And so she was using her kind of pattern recognition, incredible memory, using some scripts pretty effectively in order to manage conversations. But that was all very effortful. And it's really like, if you think about talking to someone who's gifted in mathematics, and you say, well, you need to show your work, solve the problem, how you solve the problem. It drives them nuts, because they kind of go like, well, I just knew the answer. It was intuitive, right? It's the same thing kind of flipped on its head with these social situations for gifted autistic kids. They're having to kind of actually show their work in a way and think through all the steps one step at a time, whereas others, a gifted person without autism, can much more intuitively navigate those social situations and conversations.
Are there things that parents, educators in the community can do, and there are probably a lot of things, to support autistic individuals, gifted individuals, things that they typically don't get right?
Sure. I think a good rule of thumb is to start from a place of curiosity. So joining the child or student, kind of thinking about it as like sitting or standing next to them versus over them and going like, okay, so why are we here? Like, why is this difficult? I've noticed this. I wonder what would help, and kind of get curious with them about whatever the struggle is versus trying to fix it for them or telling them what to do differently. Because you're really engaging those gifted strengths and allowing them to, you're also modeling the skill of self-reflection and problem solving and doing it with them so that eventually they can start to do that more on their own. There's a couple of really wonderful resources I'll point to just because, for sake of time, it would be hard to touch on all the good ideas out there. But for educators in particular, reel2e.org, so REEL, the number 2 and an E.org, is out of Bridges Graduate School, where they've created a master's program around cognitive diversity. And they have a just absolutely wonderful free downloadable handout that's full of accommodation ideas at every level, elementary, middle school, high school. And for parents and other allied professionals, I really love the Bright and Quirky website, so brightandquirky.com. Lots of wonderful talks and resources you can access there. And if anyone is interested, I have the handout that I provided for my AAPDN talk is over a page of hyperlinks to resources to support gifted autistic individuals, and they can email me, and I'm happy to send that too.
It's a fabulous resource. And I want to make sure that I put a link to all of the resources you mentioned in the show notes. Dr. Helmen, I'm so grateful for you sitting down with me today for this discussion. It really is a conversation that highlights the importance of understanding neurodivergence. Again, you talked about adjusting our approaches, our expectations, creating these inclusive environments and communities, and providing the support, environmental and mental health support that individuals need to thrive. I think it's just so important to understand the difficulties in the way we present as humans and the differences in the kinds of support that we need to navigate the world.
Well, thank you. I think as we were saying before we started recording, we share a similar mission and really wanting, I would like for more people to better understand these often misunderstood kids, and, started to create some infographics that you can download on my website. I do have one for gifted and autistic kids, and trying to do lots of speaking and training on this and other topics. And so if I can continue in that mission, if others are in need of training for their educators or their therapy groups or otherwise, I'm available to do that and love speaking on these topics.
And I was going to ask you too, because I know that listeners are going to want to connect with you. And what is the best way for them to reach out to you? Is it via email or a website? I'd love to send them there.
Sure. So for clinical needs, if someone is interested in evaluation in the state of Minnesota, you can connect with me through my website. So it's developmental-discoveries.com is our clinic website. And I work with 2 other wonderful psychologists who share the same areas of interest. And for speaking and education-related needs, my email is Dr. Megan Presents, so DRMEGAN presents @gmail.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Helmen. It was just a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope that you've learned a great deal. Be sure to reach out to Dr. Helmen. Her information is in the show notes. And if you'd like to learn more about autism in girls and understanding the gifted and twice exceptional child, be sure to check out episodes 38 and 119 of the podcast. The links are in the show notes. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.